In the last few years, it's become incredibly popular to talk about times where a player was offended, and then he went out and did something remarkable on the court in response. Two of the most obvious players you hear this frequently about are Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant. With that being said, players have been taking things personally and using it as motivation, going all the way back to the early days of the league. Today, I have a story about the greatest winner in NBA history, in an instance where he took something personally and went out and achieved history in response. Now, as most of us all know, Bill Russell has more rings than fingers, as he won 11 championships throughout his NBA career. His Celtics dominated the 1960s like no team has ever dominated the league before or since. At one point, Boston had won 8 consecutive NBA titles, as they became the model of excellence within the game of basketball. It's easy to simply look upon that great success on a surface level, and just assume that the Celtics steamrolled the league as juggernauts and were never considered as underdogs during that winning era. But that's actually not the case at all. We pick up our story at the end of the 1967-68 season. It's the NBA Finals between Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics, and Jerry West and Elgin Baylor of the Los Angeles Lakers. Since Bill Russell was drafted, this was the 6th time that the Lakers and Celtics met up in the NBA Finals, and each and every one of those times, the Celtics had won the championship. Boston had an absolute stranglehold on this series, but that didn't mean that it didn't feel like the tides were changing. Although there was a gap between the Celtics and Lakers, the gap was closing, and it was closing fast. Bill Russell was just reaching his mid-30s, and the rumors of his eventual retirement were now fully underway. On the other hand, the Lakers were a much younger team, and their best player, Jerry West, was just reaching the prime of his career. After years of crushing the regular season, regularly finishing around 60 wins, Boston had slowed down a bit, and in the 1967-68 regular season, they finished with a 54-28 record, which was only slightly better than the Lakers' 52-30 record. Heading into the 1968 NBA Finals, people were expecting this matchup to be far more competitive than it typically was, and that's exactly what happened. Bill Russell and the Celtics eventually went on to beat these Lakers in 6 games. But it wasn't an easy 6-game series, as the average margin of victory was only 1.5 points per game. As optimistic as the Lakers felt heading into that postseason, they ultimately left the 68 Finals hanging their heads in failure, as they were now 0-6 against Bill Russell's Celtics. With that being said, their confidence would be restored in that upcoming offseason, and in a powerful way. On July 9th, 1968, the Lakers achieved one of the greatest and most lopsided trades in NBA history. The Lakers had acquired Wilt Chamberlain from the Philadelphia 76ers, in exchange for Darrell Imhoff, Archie Clark, and Jerry Chambers. What Los Angeles was adding to their already powerful roster was a superstar center who had just led his team to a championship in 1967. Now the Lakers had star power that absolutely no one could match on paper. Jerry West and Elgin Baylor were each annual MVP contenders, and Wilt Chamberlain was simply the most statistically dominant player in the history of the game. This was the first time in basketball history that a team was widely being referred to as a super team. The Lakers had already believed that they were preparing to take the torch from the Celtics, but now they believed they were going to do it with overwhelming force. In the media, the narrative was that the age of the Celtics was over, the time of the Lakers had come. The hype was intense, as Los Angeles packed out their first preseason game with an attendance of 12,443 fans, which at the time was the largest basketball crowd that the city of Los Angeles had ever seen. Energized by their new superstar and by their resurrected confidence, the Lakers dominated the regular season, finishing with the best record in the Western Conference. On the other hand, the Boston Celtics were beginning to show their age, and were struggling to a greater extent than they were accustomed to. They finished the regular season with only a 48-34 record, which was the only time during the decade that they finished below 50 wins. At this point in basketball history, only 8 teams made it to the NBA playoffs, which means that these 4th-seeded Celtics barely made the cut. Heading into these playoffs, it appeared to be clear to everyone that the super team Lakers were the team to beat. Despite their mediocre regular season showing, the Celtics hit the switch in the playoffs, tapping into their experience and maturity, as they defeated the 55-win 76ers in 5 games, and then they defeated the 54-win Knicks in 6 games. This set up yet another epic finals matchup between the historic rivals, the Lakers and the Celtics. Now before this, the Lakers and Celtics had met up 6 times in the regular season, and the Lakers won 4 out of those 6 matchups, with the last victory for Los Angeles being a 35-point beatdown in Boston Garden, which took place roughly a week before the playoffs were set to begin. So not only did the Lakers have a better record, and not only were they clearly the more talented team on paper, but they had also been abusing the Celtics all season long. All signs were pointing to this year being a coronation for LA. Of course, some people believe the Celtics would find a way to win yet again, because that's what they always seem to do. But all conventional evidence was pointing to the rise of a new power in the league. When the finals began, things proceeded to go exactly as expected, as the Lakers' Big Three dominated Game 1, scoring 92 points combined between their three-headed monster. After 2 games, the Lakers were in a commanding position, leading the series 2-0. With that being said, Bill Russell and John Havlicek always performed with elite desperation when their backs were against the wall. At the end of Game 6, Boston had successfully done the unthinkable and forced an improbable Game 7 in Los Angeles. Now here's the thing. Heading into Game 7, 3 games had been played in Los Angeles, and 3 games had been played in Boston. The Lakers had won all 3 games in LA, while the Celtics won all 3 games in Boston. With Game 7 being held in the Forum in Los Angeles, the Lakers had every reason to be extremely confident that they were going to win the championship and finally put an end to the Celtics' reign over the league. The one person who led that confident charge for the Lakers organization was the Lakers owner, Jack Kent Cooke. With supreme conviction that his team was going to win Game 7, Jack made celebration plans for as soon as the Lakers hypothetically won the game, and he made these plans public to everyone. Jack made sure that a flyer was placed on each and every spectator's seat prior to the game, and on the flyer it said, "When, not if, the Lakers win the title, balloons will be released from the rafters, the USC marching band will play Happy Days Are Here again, and broadcaster Chick Hearn will interview Elgin Baylor, Jerry West, and Wilt Chamberlain in that order." Now these balloons were being held in the rafters with the giant net, and printed onto each of these balloons was the words "World Champion Lakers." These balloons could be seen easily by everyone on the basketball court. Before tip-off, word reached the Celtics locker room about the Lakers' arrogant celebration plans, and obviously, as competitors, the Celtics players were extremely infuriated, and none of them were more angry than the Celtics leader, Bill Russell. During the pregame shoot-around, the Celtics could see the balloons as they were practicing. Soon afterwards, the star players met up at center court, which is customary prior to the start of a championship game. When Jerry West and Bill Russell came face to face with one another, Russell looked directly at him and said, "Those f***ing balloons are staying up there." The challenge had been made and the table was set. Tip-off took place, and what ensued was one of the greatest games in the history of the NBA. Jerry West did his part, putting up a 40-point triple-double. Wilt Chamberlain also showed up with a monstrous effort, but an untimely injury forced him to miss the final minutes of an extremely close contest. Although the Celtics were up by as many as 17 points in the fourth quarter, Los Angeles stormed back to make the game a nail-biter in the final minutes. But that's when Bill Russell came through and fulfilled his promise. On the night, Russell had 6 points, 21 rebounds, and 6 assists. He led all Celtics players in minutes, rebounds, assists, and presumably blocks, as his key rebounds and defensive stops were the major difference maker down the stretch. When the buzzer sounded, the Celtics had done it yet again, as they defeated the Lakers for the 7th time in the NBA Finals. Bill Russell now had 11 championship rings, and this victory made him 10-0 in deciding 7th games. And, of course, those balloons did in fact stay up there. If there's one thing to learn from this video, is that you never, ever bet against Bill Russell in the NBA Finals, especially in a Game 7, regardless of the opposition and regardless of the odds. So what do you guys think? What's your favorite story about a player taking something personally? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comment section below.
William Felton Russell, more commonly known as Bill Russell, is one of the most iconic legends of NBA history. He's widely recognized as the game's ultimate winner, as he has more championship rings than any other player of league history with a total of 11. Despite having more rings than fingers, Russell has significantly less hardware than he actually deserves, since he played in the NBA at a time when many accolades and awards had not yet been invented. Honors like the NBA's All-Defensive Teams, the Defensive Player of the Year award, and the Finals MVP did not exist throughout the vast majority of Bill Russell's career. He already has a dominant resume worthy of putting himself in the GOAT argument, but his incredible body of work only becomes tremendously more impressive once you consider the additional awards he likely would have accumulated if they had always been available. Today, we're taking a look at Russell's career and considering its magnificence when the additional accolades are applied to his legacy. First off, let's start by considering Russell's impact and reputation as a defensive player. Bill is respected and remembered for his elite rebounding, his clutch gene, and for his team-first approach. But above all else, Russell is revered for his tenacious and dominating presence on the defensive end, as many of his peers, fans, and basketball enthusiasts in general consider him as the greatest defensive player of NBA history. Unfortunately, the Defensive Player of the Year award did not exist until 1982, and blocks and steals were not an officially tracked stat until 1973, which means there is a lot of details that we don't know about his career defensively. But with that being said, there is a decent amount that we do know about what he achieved defensively. Bill played a total of 13 seasons in the NBA, and during that stretch, he led the NBA in defensive win shares in 11 out of those 13 seasons, in some instances even doubling the amount of defensive win shares as the closest competitor. At one point, he led the league in defensive win shares for an entire decade straight. Remember, this was in the same era when Wilt Chamberlain was also playing his prime basketball, and Russell still had a stranglehold on the league defensively. Wilt finished ahead of Bill in defensive win shares in only one season of his career, and more often than not, it wasn't even close in Russell's favor. Not only that, but his defensive presence in the paint was showing up in the results for his team as well, as Russell's Celtics finished as the NBA's #1 ranked defense in 12 out of his 13 seasons in the league. His defensive impact was so strong that his Celtics were able to win the NBA championship on 3 occasions, while simultaneously being the worst team in the league offensively, which they did in 1961, 1963, and 1964. No other team in league history has ever done that. The Celtics also had the best overall record in the entire NBA in 9 out of his 13 seasons. Remember, Bill Russell won 5 League MVP awards, which is the second most in NBA history, and he won those awards mostly as an acknowledgement of his supreme defense, despite being relatively limited offensively. So it's fair to ask, how many accolades do you think he would have got if they were exclusively about his defense? To put it simply, Russell would have absolutely dominated the Defensive Player of the Year award like no one else has in all of history. He played less than 69 games in only one of his 13 seasons, which means he was almost always eligible for the awards. Based on what we know, on the low end, he's winning as few as 8 Defensive Player of the Year awards, and on the high end, he's winning as many as 11. Either way, he's easily the all-time leader in Defensive Player of the Year's won, as the current record holder is a total of 4 shared by Dikembe Mutombo and Ben Wallace. Even on the low end, Bill would have at least double the amount of DPOYs compared to the closest defender of league history. He's also likely earning a first-team all-defensive spot in anywhere from 9 to 12 seasons of his career. Regardless of whether it's 9, 10, 11, or 12 selections, it's the most in NBA history. If this was all the case, I honestly believe that Bill Russell would stand out more defensively than Michael Jordan or Wilt Chamberlain do offensively, as there would be absolutely no argument about who the greatest defender to ever live was, and it would be laughable to even suggest otherwise. It's important to note that during Bill Russell's era, the awards were actually voted and decided by the players themselves and not by members of the media like it is today. This means that Russell's dominance defensively wasn't only the perception, but it was also the first-hand on-the-court experience of both his teammates and his opponents, which carries even more weight in my humble opinion. One common perception among players and fans of that generation is that Wilt Chamberlain wasn't always giving 100% effort and energy defensively, and would sometimes visibly take nights off when he wasn't feeling as motivated. This was never something that was a concern for Russell. On the contrary, Russell was known to be absolutely obsessive about competing, as he would sometimes build an anxious anticipation in the pregame to the point of vomiting. Russell's all-consuming desire to win undeniably resulted in him giving the most effort possible on the court defensively on a night-to-night basis. Another crucial award that did not exist throughout Bill Russell's career was the Finals MVP, which is a pretty unfortunate detail for a guy who won 11 championship rings. Michael Jordan certainly has an argument, but Bill Russell may just be the ultimate clutch performer, as he has a perfect 10-0 record in deciding 7th games in the postseason, and he was ridiculously productive in those do-or-die games. The NBA Finals as a whole were not much different, as Russell had a knack for performing his best when games mattered most. I've researched all of his performances in the NBA Finals, and I definitely think he's winning the award in these finals, and he's possibly winning the award in these finals, which means that on the low end, he's winning as few as 7 Finals MVPs, and on the high end, he's winning as many as 10 Finals MVPs. Either way, it's the most in NBA history. Now that we've analyzed and broke down all of these factors, let's take a look at Russell's complete resume as it should be. With all of this hardware added to his resume, what do you think it does for his legacy and for his ranking on the NBA's all-time list? I'll just say simply that it would clearly do a lot. Let me know in the comments section if some of these details affect the way you view Bill Russell on the NBA's all-time list. I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Russell wasn't just a legend on the court, but off of it as well, as he was seen as a respected and larger-than-life personality who surely left a lasting impact on the generations after him. Many content creators have honored Bill with videos that cover the story of his life and legacy. I thought I would honor him by providing information that you may have not heard before. Here's numerous facts about the career of Bill Russell. One of Russell's greatest friends, and throughout his career one of his greatest rivals, was the legendary center Wilt Chamberlain. Wilt and Bill had a legendary rivalry for the ages, as the Giants clashed on a regular basis, as they both attempted to assert their dominance over the league. One of the reasons their rivalry is so legendary is because of how many times these two competitors battled it out. Some of the other greatest rivalries of NBA history would be Magic Johnson versus Larry Bird, Michael Jordan versus Isaiah Thomas, Shaquille O'Neal versus Kobe Bryant, and Kevin Durant versus Russell Westbrook. But what's crazy is that all of these other great rivalries combined still don't have as many games played against each other as Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain had by themselves, as the two battled it out a total of 143 times throughout their careers. Bill was never known to be an explosive scorer, but he did impact the game in numerous other ways, primarily with his rebounding, defense, and passing. With that being said, in the history of the league, there have only been 9 times where a player has averaged less than 20 points per game and still won the league MVP. Astonishingly, Bill Russell has 5 of those specific MVPs, which is more than the rest of league history altogether. Speaking of Bill's non-offensive impact, many people often consider him as the greatest defensive player to ever live. But unfortunately, many of our modern-day defensive statistics didn't exist during his career. But one of the ones we do have are his defensive win shares. He didn't just dominate this stat, but based on how much he owned it, the stat might as well be named after him. Bill played a total of 13 seasons in the NBA, and incredibly, he led the league in defensive win shares in 11 of those seasons. Second place on the all-time list doesn't even have half as many seasons as Russell did, which was George Mikan and Tim Duncan, who led the league 5 times apiece. Right behind John Havlicek is Paul Pierce for the most points ever scored by a Boston Celtic. Pierce was known as the Truth and could score a ton of buckets in a small amount of time. With his lethal shooting, Pierce made a name for himself in the NBA playoffs with his many high-scoring affairs. With that being said, remarkably, Bill Russell has more games in the playoffs with at least 30 rebounds than Paul Pierce does with at least 30 points. Bill Russell was a winner, we all know this, but he wasn't simply a winner based on his luck and circumstances. The main reason he was so successful is because he was arguably the most clutch basketball player to ever live. Russell played in a total of 10 deciding Game 7s throughout the course of his career, and he never lost a single one of them. He was leaned upon heavily in those games as he played 488 out of a possible 495 minutes. If Bill isn't dominating without taking almost any rest, then they likely lose some of those Game 7s, as 6 out of those 10 games were decided by only one possession. The reality was that if Russell had an off night in any one of those Game 7s, then he's losing a championship ring because of it. But instead, we now remember him as the legend who has more rings than fingers. Nikola Jokic and Wilt Chamberlain are often recognized as the greatest passing big men of NBA history, which is warranted, but often overlooked in that aspect is Bill Russell, whose court vision and unselfish nature allowed him to be one of the all-time great givers as well. Russell actually has the third highest career assists per game average among centers in NBA history, reaching as high as 5.8 in 1967. Bill had many modern players that he developed a close relationship with, and he had a high level of respect for many of those players. But there was only one player who Russell referred to as his absolute favorite, and that was the San Antonio Spurs legend, Tim Duncan. The statement from Bill came from a discussion with Duncan many years ago, and he equated his fondness to their similarities and the fact that Duncan played hard, played smart, and won championships. It makes sense given how similar these superstars were in their approach to the game and their quiet lead-by-example type style. As I've already alluded to in this video, Bill Russell and Wilt Chamberlain had a very fierce rivalry, to the point of the two being extremely petty with one another at times. Well, in 1965, Wilt Chamberlain signed a 3-year, $100,000 contract, which at the time made him the highest paid player in the NBA. When Bill Russell caught news of this, he was furious and demanded that the Boston Celtics pay him more than Wilt Chamberlain, otherwise he would consider retiring on the spot. The Celtics obliged and renegotiated Russell's contract and increased his income from $75,000 to $100,001, so that he was now the highest paid player in all of the NBA. These are just some of the amazing facts and details about Bill Russell. What are some of your favorites about him? Let me know in the comment section below. To me, easily the most underrated part of Russell's game was his leaping ability. For some reason, everybody talks about the incredible athleticism of Wilt Chamberlain, yet Bill Russell's jaw-dropping ability becomes somewhat of an afterthought. It's quite insane how two of the most athletically gifted centers in NBA history both conveniently played in the 1960s. Some of you may have not seen the clip where Russell is sprinting on a fast break, and then he jumps clear over the opposing defender on his way to converting the basket. This single play is evidence of his world-class leaping ability, and when I say world-class, I'm not being facetious. In 1956, Bill Russell participated in the West Coast Relays high jump competition. In this contest, Bill cleared 6 feet 9.25 inches, which tied him for first place with Charlie Dumas. Russell could have went on to the Olympics that year, but instead, he decided to focus on his basketball career. The man he tied with, Charlie Dumas, went on to win the Olympic gold medal in the high jump competition. Luckily for him, he didn't have the insanely competitive Bill Russell going up against him. At the time, Track and Field News had Russell ranked as the 7th best high jumper in the world, and as the 2nd best high jumper in the United States. All of that absurd athleticism was packed into a 6-foot 10-inch frame. It's no wonder why he won so much. More often than not, it's offensive players who win the MVP awards and who get all of the attention. But make no mistake, the defensive end of the court deserves more credit, as it's literally half of the game. Today, I'm breaking down my list of the top 10 greatest defensive players in NBA history, and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree with these choices. Before I get into it, let me first explain how my list works. Although defensive accolades are important, they are not the only major factor, as they're given based on the media members voting, which I might not necessarily agree with. The defensive awards also have a lot to do with who they were up against, so obviously, if the competition was stronger, then it's harder to win the award on a yearly basis. And lastly, this list is a combination of peak defensive abilities and longevity. For example, a player like Mark Eaton was one of the greatest rim protectors in his prime, but he had a relatively shorter career. When you compare his 10 seasons of elite defense to Tim Duncan's 19, well then it's obvious who's making the list and who isn't. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 10, Michael Jordan. MJ is the only guard to make my list, which really tells you just how difficult it is for a perimeter defender to stand out amongst the crowd. MJ deserves the spot though, as he was an absolute menace to opposing guards. He was first team all-defense a total of 9 times, which is tied for the most in NBA history. Among guards, he has the highest blocks per game average in NBA history, and he's currently 4th on the all-time list in total steals, regardless of the fact that he played fewer seasons than most of the players in the top 25. At his best, he won the Defensive Player of the Year in 1988, where he averaged 3.2 steals and 1.6 blocks, which made him 1st overall in steals per game and 1st among guards in blocks per game. Number 9. Ben Wallace. His longevity may have not been enough to get him in the top 5, but his peak was certainly enough to get him in the top 10. This 6'9" center/power forward was one of the strongest players to ever do it, and he was one of the few men who could actually do a decent job of containing a prime Shaquille O'Neal. His best years were on the suffocating Detroit Pistons of the mid-2000s, and it was during this stretch that he won the Defensive Player of the Year award 4 times in a span of 5 seasons. Regardless of the fact that he was relatively undersized as a center, he was still able to be a solid shot blocker, leading the league overall in the 2002 season. He was also solid at stripping the ball from the opponent, as he averaged 1.3 steals over the course of his career. In total, he made 6 all-defense teams, which is actually the fewest of all eligible players on my list. And as I mentioned before, that was a product of his lack of elite longevity. But when he was at his best, there are very few defenders more intimidating than Wallace. Number 8. Scottie Pippen. Although Michael Jordan may have averaged slightly more steals and more blocks, there was no question that Pippen was the most smothering on-ball defender for their 6 championship runs. Somehow, Scottie never won the Defensive Player of the Year award, which was probably a product of there being so many all-time great defensive centers in his era, but Pippen was the runner-up to Dikembe Mutombo in 1995 and to Gary Payton in 1996. In the totality of his career, Pippen made 10 all-defense teams, and 8 of those selections were first team, which ties him for the 5th most in NBA history. Within his complete body of work were some key moments where Pippen displayed his abilities, like when he took on the assignment of defending and containing Magic Johnson in the 1991 NBA Finals. Number 7. Tim Duncan. Just like Pippen, Duncan never won the Defensive Player of the Year award, as he never led the league in steals or blocks. And with Bruce Bowen on his team for some years, you could even argue that there were stretches where he wasn't even the best defensive player on his team. But for what Duncan lacked in peak performance, he made up for it with his insane longevity and consistency. For his career, Duncan earned a whopping total of 15 all-defense team selections in his 19 years of pro basketball. That's easily the most selections in NBA history. Many players enjoy being an elite defender in their 20s, but Duncan carried that tremendous impact into his late 30s, as his intelligence and rim protection was a pivotal aspect of their final championship run in 2014. Number 6. Kevin Garnett. Especially during his time in Minnesota, the big ticket was a nightmare for opposing teams, as he was always bringing the energy and intensity on defense. Like the legendary Hakeem Olajuwon, Garnett was usually among the league leaders in blocks and steals simultaneously. For many years, his elite defense appeared to go unnoticed, but in his first season as a member of the contending Boston Celtics, he was rewarded with the Defensive Player of the Year. In total, he made 12 All-Defense teams, which is tied for the second most of all time, and 9 of those were first team, which is tied with Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, and Gary Payton for the most of all time. Add in the fact that he shut the Lakers down in the paint during the 2008 championship run, and I'm very comfortable having Garnett just outside my top 5. Number 5. David Robinson. Well before the big fundamental was locking down the paint for San Antonio, the Admiral was doing it at a higher level. Over a 6-season stretch from 1990 to 1996, Robinson was averaging a monstrous 3.6 blocks per game. All-time great rim protectors like Tim Duncan and Dwight Howard never had a single season where they averaged that many blocks per game, and Robinson did it over a 6-year stretch. He was also regularly among the league leaders in steals per game, regardless of the fact that he played at the center position, and he got as high as 2.3 steals per game in 1992, which was 5th in the league overall. He was the Defensive Player of the Year in 1992, and he earned a total of 8 All-Defense teams. Due to his service in the US Navy, Robinson didn't debut in his rookie season until the age of 24, and if he had got an earlier start to his career like many players do, then he would likely have even more defensive accolades than he already does. Number 4. Wilt Chamberlain. He's most famous for his accomplishments on offense, but Wilt was arguably just as dominant on the defensive end of the court. Since blocks and steals were not officially tracked until 1973, it's basically impossible to accurately estimate his defensive numbers over the entirety of his career. With that being said, Wilt's blocks were unofficially tracked over a 112-game span, and he averaged a mind-blowing 8.8 blocks over that stretch. Obviously, blocked shots are difficult to compare across eras, considering numerous variables, like how the three-point line didn't exist yet. But regardless, that's still insanely impressive no matter how you slice it. There are many examples of Wilt controlling games defensively. Some may say that he should be in the number 1 spot, based on his insane numbers and reputation, but I would disagree, as Wilt also had a bit of a reputation for occasionally taking some nights off defensively. Nonetheless, I certainly believe he deserves a spot in the top 5. Number 3. Dennis Rodman. The Worm's case defensively is a bit more complicated than some people may realize. Statistically, he was nothing to marvel at, as he has never had a single season where he averaged at least 1 block or 1 steal. What he did well, though, was frustrate the offensive player with his smothering on-ball defense, and force him into either a bad shot or into passing the basketball. I also believe that Rodman had the most versatile defensive career of all time. At different points in history, he was assigned to guard the best player from every position on the court. In the 80s, he was asked to guard Magic Johnson at point guard, Michael Jordan at shooting guard, and Larry Bird at small forward. And then in the 90s, he was asked to guard Karl Malone at power forward and Shaquille O'Neal at center. And Rodman did more than an adequate job of all of those tasks. In his career, he made a total of 8 All-Defense teams, and he won the Defensive Player of the Year in back-to-back seasons as a member of the Bad Boy Pistons. Number 2. Hakeem Olajuwon. I've said it once, I'll say it again. The Dream was an absolute nightmare on defense, as he had the length, athleticism, and intelligence to be one of the select few greatest defenders ever. Officially, he's the NBA's all-time leader in blocked shots, and second place isn't even close. On top of that, he's currently 10th on the NBA's all-time list in total steals, which is completely insane for a center. The closest center to Hakeem is David Robinson, who is 54 spots below him on the all-time list. Over his career, Hakeem made 9 All-Defense teams, and he won the Defensive Player of the Year twice. It is worth mentioning that he finished in the top 3 of the Defensive Player of the Year voting a whopping 6 times. A couple things that are rarely appreciated about Hakeem was his chase down speed and his lateral quickness, which helped him block and contest many shots from speedy guards and wings. He was truly the standard of defensive excellence in the 1990s. Here is my list of honorable mentions. Feel free to pause the video for a longer look. Should any of these players have made it into the top 10? Let me know below. Number 1. Bill Russell. Back when Russell and the Celtics dominated the NBA, the Defensive Player of the Year did not exist yet, so because of this, they often gave him the MVP award instead. Russell was a relentless competitor, and with his Olympian level of athleticism, he established himself as arguably the greatest rim protector in the history of the game. Just like Wilt Chamberlain, who I mentioned earlier, Bill Russell's blocks and steals were never officially tracked, but that doesn't entirely mean that we couldn't gauge his defensive impact. In 11 out of his 13 seasons in the NBA, Russell led the league in defensive win shares. That's more than doubled second place, which is George Mikan and Tim Duncan with 5. The most Defensive Player of the Year awards by one player is a total of 4, which is an honor shared by Ben Wallace and Dikembe Mutombo. If that award had existed during Bill Russell's era, then he likely would have at least doubled that total. Bill Russell built a legacy for himself and won 11 championships with defense as his greatest skill set, in the same era that Wilt Chamberlain played in the NBA. If that isn't a strong case for being the greatest defender of all time, then I don't know what is. So what do you guys think? How does your list differ from mine? I look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching as always, make sure to like and subscribe for more basketball content, and I'll see you guys in the next video.